individual identities in harmony with the times, but respectful of what is understood as national tradition. So today, the local traditions of submission to the authorities, of respect for long-standing hierarchies, of assimilating religion as an integral part of the community, are in open competition with imported models in which religion, in particular Islam, is lived as a more universal religion, less subordinated to the national or local social tradition, more contestatory, and more individualist. There are many, of course, different research axes through which we can investigate how religion articulates itself, both through localized identities based on community belonging, kinship, ethnic or national references, and with globalized identities, UMA, some transnational brotherhoods, proselytizing groups, and at both the individual and collective levels, the traditional ways of expressing religion are incurred in local processes and understood as code of social conduct. We also try in this program to discuss how religion participates in shaping generational struggles and in accentuating the dissociations between rural regions and more globalized urban landscapes. And finally, we try to investigate how it can be used as a tool to express societal transformations and therefore open new political spaces for mediating them. So, well, there are, of course, a lot of topics. Obviously, we won't be able to address all of them today, but I'm more than delighted to welcome today's three excellent scholars who are specialists, all of them on religion, but who work on different regions, on Georgia, on Russia, and on Xinjiang. And this is all the more important that the aim of this program is really to try to compare religion in different regions in Eurasia and even beyond. So we have today Liliya Karimova, Ruslan Baramidze, and Timothy Grose. We will start with Liliya, who recently received her PhD in communication from UMass Amherst. I don't know if I pronounce well the word, but she's an independent researcher and a professor or lecturer in the Department of Organizational Science and Communication here at GW. She has published in Nova Religio, the Journal of Alternative and Emergent Religions, and the Journal of Intercultural Communication Research. And her research interests focus on Muslim women, identity, piety discourse, and Islam in Russia. And today, Liliya will talk about Muslim identity in Russia through an ethnographic lens, the case of Muslim Tatar women in Tatarstan. Liliya, the floor is yours.
Thank you for such a general introduction, Sebastian, and thank you for being here. So as Sebastian just said, today I will talk about Islam and identity in Russia through an ethnographic lens. Specifically, I will focus on the case of Muslim Tatar women in the Russian Republic of Tatarstan, which is very centrally located in Russia. So the women that I interviewed, spent time with, did my field work, did ethnographic work, they are right in the middle of Russia. I would like to open with a story. During my research, one time during my research, I observed an older Tatar woman who was conducting an informal mosque lesson. Those lessons, by the way, mosque lessons are very common nowadays in Tatarstan, in Kazan, and a woman called Abastai, who is a female religious authority, she collects pupils who are interested in becoming more religiously observant, who are interested in learning more about Islam. So these women, they collect students and they teach them different aspects of Islam. And it varies based on the proficiency of their students. So it can be anything basic from how to recite the 5 daily prayers to how to read the Quran and other aspects of Islam. So in this particular instance, the older woman had a class of younger students in the capital city of Kazan in the Kul Sharif Mosque. This is, by the way, not the picture of the class that I'm talking about, but it's a picture of a mosque lesson, informal mosque lesson at a different mosque. Here we have an older generation of women with an older teacher. But the case I'm talking about, the teacher was an older Tatar woman, ethnic Tatar woman, and like I said, she had a class of about 10 young girls who were studying in Kazan. Most of them were studying in Kazan. And because most of them were somewhat new to the practice of Islam, they were eager to learn how to pray correctly. So at some point during the lesson, the teacher suggested, she said, okay, would I have a volunteer showing me how to recite a prayer? So one girl volunteered, let's call her Guzal. She volunteered to perform a prayer. She performed it, and after she performed it, the teacher corrected her. She said, in certain ways, actually what she said exactly was, we don't do it this way here. And she pointed out to specific gestures that the girl was performing during the prayer. So what the story illustrates, and I will get back to the story at the end of my presentation, but what the story illustrates is that in the context of Muslim revival taking place in Tatarstan today, Tatars' religious identity is the center of both public and private debates. And there are several dimensions to it. One is, to what extent should Islam define Tatars' identity and therefore their future? And if Islam should indeed be part of it, what kind of Islam should Tatars practice? So to shed the light on the first question, let's look at some statistics. Islam is definitely becoming a more growing force in Russia and in Tatarstan. So I have here some numbers. These numbers represent Muslim revival in Russia. So if we compare numbers of missionaries who teach in Russia from abroad, their number has increased between 19 and 97. If we look at the number of students from Russia studying abroad, their number also has increased. The number of mosques, and finally pilgrims who perform Hajj, the holy pilgrimage, also has been rising. And I also have a few statistics at the Tatarstan level. Here we see that the number of Muslim communities has risen between 1988 and 1998. The number of mosques has risen, and also there are several sociological studies that has shown that Islam is becoming more important among everyday people. Regular Tatars are becoming more and more interested in their religion. For example, the number of urban Tatar mosque goers has been increasing, and especially, I don't know if you can see it, but younger people are becoming more and more interested in Islam. And here I have observant Tatar youth. Their numbers again have increased, say between 2001 and 2004 by 3 times. These are just few statistical studies that again indicate that Islam is indeed part of the Tatar society, and people are more and more becoming interested in Islam. So perhaps the more important question is, what kind of Islam should Tatars practice? What kind of Islam should become part of their identity and therefore define their future? And here the debate is built around the notion of traditional Islam. And on one level, it can be equated with, for example, in Tatarstan, it can be equated with the Hanafi school of Muslim law. But it can also be perceived as something that always has been done by us and our ancestors. So both at the government and everyday level, when people talk about traditional Islam, they do not always refer to a particular Muslim tradition, but they can refer to certain practices that are perceived to have always been there. And in this context, religious practices, physical manifestations such as the style of the daily prayer, the way women wear their clothes, the way women tie their scarves, the way men wear their beards, or the length of their trousers, or the way one eats, or their dietary restrictions, or even language and discourse. So those physical manifestations of religious practices are often perceived as true markers of one's religious identity. And gender is very important here because in normative Islam, corporeal practices are regulated along gender lines. So this debate is happening both at the government level and at the level of ordinary people, ordinary Muslims. So to give you an example, you may remember the 2012 Stavropol case in which 5 Muslim girls were banned from attending a public school because they were wearing hijabs. Here is what President Putin said on this case. He said, I quote, "When it comes to hijabs, you know that in our culture, when I say our, I mean traditional Islam. Hijabs don't exist, and we are going to implement traditions that are foreign to us. Why? And of course, we all have to pay attention to this and talk about it directly, and refer in this case, of course, to the representatives of traditional Islam." So he was implying here that because these girls were wearing hijabs, hijabs were foreign, and therefore somehow they were bringing in, their families were bringing in non-traditional Islam onto the Russian land. But this debate and this discourse is also present among ordinary Muslims, and ordinary Muslims are very much aware of the fact that their practices can be and often are perceived as true markers of their identity. Here I have an example of, or an excerpt of an interview I had with a young Muslim woman. I'll call her Farida here. And in her conversation with me, she explained, for example, why her family in their hometown were called Wahhabi. Her family was perceived as a Wahhabi family, particularly her parents. And this is what she said. When I asked her to explain, well, why is your family perceived as Wahhabi? What do they do? What happened? And she said, and by the way, interviews that I quote here, they are representative of a particular phenomenon that I discussed. Obviously, I could not quote all of the 70 interviews that I conducted. So here's what Farida said, quote, "Tatars have such concept as a religious dinner, right? My parents are not against such dinners, but they are against men and women sitting together in one room. They believe that men should be sitting apart from women. It's in accordance with the Sharia. Even for basic things, they tell my mom, why do you wear your scarf in the front? Wear it in the back." So what Farida is doing here, she explained to me that the reason why her family was called Wahhabi is because they were conducting certain religious practices, or they believed in certain religious practices, such as separation of a religious gathering along gender lines that were considered to be non-traditional and therefore radical, Wahhabi. Or because her mother wore her scarf, tied it in the front, again, that was the reason why she was perceived, one of the reasons why her family was perceived as Wahhabi. She also referred, so it's not true only for women, it's also true for men, because she also referred at some point in our conversation to her father, and she said that because her father wore a long beard, even in times of crisis where when certain Muslims were put to jail, he was not afraid, he continued wearing his beard that certain way, but that he was perceived as a Wahhabi. So here again is an example of how physical manifestations, what physical practices are often perceived as true markers of one's religious identity in present-day Russia. This particular debate, again, that centers around these physical manifestations has both a gender and also a generational dimension to it. For example, an older generation of Tatars, those who are 60 and roughly saying 60 plus, they're less likely to support what they may perceive as non-traditional forms of Islam and its followers. So going back to Farida, during her conversation, she told me a story about a struggle that took place in her hometown. According to Farida, when a younger generation of Muslim men began performing namaz, the daily prayer, in accordance with the Shafi'i madhab, which is not the official or dominant madhab of Tatarstan, the older men, the older imams said, I quote, "You either recite namaz the way we do, or you leave, and we won't let you into the mosque." And according to Farida, the conflict was not resolved peacefully. The younger men were not allowed into the mosque, and actually led to several of the younger men being put to jail for supposedly being too radical. So this particular quote, this particular example illustrates that, again, a physical manifestation, how one recites a prayer, in a certain way, it becomes a marker, it's perceived as a marker of one's religious identity. And like I said, the older generation is more likely to adhere to what's considered a tradition. This generational component, it further comes through in Tatar's debates about ethnic and national versus religious identity. The older generation is more likely to conflate ethno-national elements of identity with religious elements of identity. Such as, for example, which ethno-national elements am I talking about? Things like the language, certain cultural practices. So there is this conflation of, for example, Tatar language is considered, speaking Tatar is considered faras, or a religious duty for some older Muslim Tatars. Here's what one older practicing woman told me about the Russian language becoming the lingua franca of Islam in Russia. And it is happening indeed. The Russian language 20, 30 years ago perhaps in Tatarstan and even in Moscow, the lingua franca of the mosques in Islam was Tatar. Sermons were delivered in Tatar. Today, Russian is gradually forcing Tatar out. And this is what one older Tatar woman told me about this practice. She said, "Soon to our members, it's a place where imams stand, will come Ivans. It's a sacred place, and Ivans will take it soon." So by Ivans, she was implying the Russian ethnic identity of religious leaders, and she was very much disapproving of it. So for her, it didn't matter that this particular Russian person could be a very good practicing Muslim. The fact that it was an Ivan or a Russian was unacceptable to her. And this particular woman, she was very much aware of this debate of, the Russian language gradually forcing Tatar out, and she even thought about possible counter-arguments. One of the counter-arguments that could be thrown at her face was that, well, there are a lot of migrants, for example, in Russia, and even in Tatarstan and in Kazan, so they do not understand Tatar. And therefore, these sermons should be conducted in Russian so that they can also participate, they can be part of the Ummah, they can understand the sermons. And this was her response to that. She said, "Let them," meaning the migrants, build their own mosques and practice Islam in their own language. She said they come here to trade, they have the money, so let them build their own communities. Why should they take over? And she argued that Tatars should practice Islam only in Tatar and Arabic. No Russian should be involved. Which shows how important for her, which shows the conflation of religious and ethno-national identity in this case. The younger generation, and these are, I want to emphasize that these are not absolutes. These are some trends, but of course there are exceptions. Of course, the picture is more complex, but what I'm trying to tease out here is some of the trends that came out more forcefully in my research. So the younger generation of practicing Tatars, they do not conflate their religious and ethnic identity as much. And in fact, they favor Islam over ethnicity. And here's what Malika, a practicing Tatar in her early 30s, told me about the issue. She said, I quote, "If you think about the morality of society, the development of Islam, the spreading of it in a right form, faster, we shouldn't be so demanding towards the language, because the younger generation doesn't understand Tatar. They, the older generation, should have shouted in defense of Tatar during the 70 Soviet years, not now. Now it's too late. It's too late. We lost the language. It's too late." So what Malika here is saying that for us, it's more important to build a moral society based on Islam. It's more important to spread the religion, and insistence on the Tatar language, on preserving the Tatar language, is an obstacle to that. And she told me a story of how she was disapproving of this practice of the older generation. She was disapproving of the fact that, for example, her mother-in-law would scold Malika's children for speaking Tatar, and for speaking Russian, excuse me. Her mother-in-law would say, "Speak Russian. If you don't speak Russian, you'll go to hell. Speak Tatar. If you don't speak Tatar, you'll go to hell." And to Malika, this was absolutely ridiculous because it had nothing to do with religion. So again, this insistence on physical manifestations in this case, discourse, is one of the points in which this debate over which kind of Islam Tatars should practice comes out. There is another component to this debate, and I'm talking about sources of religious knowledge or religious authority. So just like physical manifestations of religion, of faith, sources of religious knowledge, in other words, which book one reads, which internet site one attends, which teachers one goes to, they can also be, and they are often perceived as true indicators of one's religious identity, true markers. And it's also happening at the level of government officials, but also among ordinary Muslims. For example, the Muslims who read the works of Said Nursi were arrested in Russia, in Tatarstan actually, not even in Russia, but also Tatarstan in 2014. Because Said Nursi was perceived, this particular source of religious knowledge, this particular religious authority was perceived outside of the tradition, outside of the norm, perhaps radical. So because these particular Muslims read and referred to this source of religious knowledge, they were incarcerated. And of course we know about bans on certain Islamic literature where certain sources of religious knowledge, again, are marked as outside of the norm, and if one happens to read them while they're on this federal list, it can get one in trouble. So sources of one's religious knowledge are very important, again, because they're perceived as true markers. And here's what Farida, the woman I talked about earlier, and what I'm arguing is that ordinary Muslims are aware of that. They're aware that, what they read, which sites they attend, which literature they read, or where they study, can be perceived as what kind of Muslim they are. And here I have a case again of Farida and her father. When I asked her about where her father received his knowledge about Islam, she provided this complicated narrative. She said, he is self-taught. He didn't study anywhere, but he completed a Hajj. He traveled to Turkey to take some courses. His first teachers of Islam were the Turks, and then he gradually switched to Arabs because the source is the Arabs. The Prophet himself was an Arab. So how can we think that Turks have more knowledge when the source of knowledge to those to whom the knowledge came were Arabs? They are the bearers of it, meaning he received Islamic knowledge from the alim, the knowledgeable people. So here Farida performed a very complicated dance. At first she said he didn't study anywhere. And I'm arguing that the reason why she said that is because she knew that, admitting that her father studied in a certain country or a certain school could, again, for me, mark his certain religious identity. So she first denied that he studied anywhere. Then she said that he studied in Turkey, which by many considered a less radical and more moderate country to study. And then she finally admitted that he studied in Arabs, and she not only admitted that, but she explained, she provided reasoning for why he switched from Turks to Arabs, because Arabs were the bearers of Islamic knowledge. So she's making this very complicated argument in defense of her father's sources of religious authority. Here, I have other examples, but I think I'm running out of time, so I will go to my conclusions. So a few points I would like to emphasize today, and hopefully that some of my interview excerpts illustrated, is that in the context of Muslim revival in Tatarstan, religious identity is very much in the center of Tatars' public, government level, but also private debates among ordinary Muslims, because it essentially is perceived to define their future. So in this context where traditional Islam is often favored over what may be perceived as non-traditional forms, physical practices, physical manifestations of faith, such as, again, the prayers, the clothing style, dietary supplements, and even the language are often perceived as true markers of one's religious identity, and so are one's sources of religious knowledge. So if you read Nursi, you must be a radical and you need to be put to jail. This is what I'm talking about. My research, however, suggests that physical practices and sources of religious knowledge, they cannot be perceived, they cannot be accepted, they cannot be taken as true indicators of one's Islamic identity, because especially in Tatarstan, in the context of the Tatar Muslim revival, where Islam is still, or active Muslim practice is still a fairly recent phenomenon, the way one learns about physical practices can be very accidental. And there is no linear progression from reading something like Nursi to believing what Nursi says to acting upon those beliefs and words. There is no linear progression, even though that's how it is often perceived by the government official, and it has a huge implications on the policy and religious policy in Russia. And returning to the story that I began with, the story of the girl who was corrected for praying in a certain way, as I found out later, the young woman, I called her Liliya, she had become interested in Islam not long before coming to Kazan to study. She came from an industrial town of Nabrizhny Chelny, west of Kazan. She became interested in Islam. She wanted to learn how to pray, because prayer is one of the 5 pillars. So as soon as one becomes interested in becoming and practicing Muslims, they feel the urge, they must pray, they must begin praying. They can't wait until tomorrow or a year or a month from now or a year from now. They have to learn and they have to start doing it now. So oftentimes it happens that, as in her case, she just went to a nearby mosque, and that's how she was taught how to pray. And she didn't realize at the time that she was performing a prayer in a style that was not in accordance with the Hanafi tradition, in a style that could essentially get her in trouble. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Liliya. If you agree, maybe we'll have the 3 presentations in a row to have a more general discussion, and maybe, of course, some more specific questions on each paper. So we'll move now to Ruslan Baramidze, who is an ethnologist who got his PhD in history. He's currently a senior researcher at Niko Berzenishvili Institute of Batumi Shota Rustaveli State University. His postgraduate studies were in ethnology at the Batumi Research Institute of the Georgian Scientific Academy. He then finished his doctoral studies in the Faculty of Humanitarian Science at Shota Rustaveli State University. And Ruslan's dissertation topic was on Islam and Muslims in Adjara. He has written 3 monographs about the Muslim community in Georgia, and a lot of papers about migration, diasporic community, identity, and the Muslim community of Georgia. And his sphere of research interests include Georgian Muslims, Islam and Muslims in Georgia, Georgian Muslim community in Turkey, religious identity, and Georgian diaspora. Ruslan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Oh, sorry, and I forgot to tell the title of your presentation, excuse me. So Ruslan will talk about the Muslim community and political processes in Georgia.
Thank you. I think it would be better if I read my text. The Muslim community and political process in Georgia. The present report deals with the specifics of the religion politics in independent Georgia based on the exemplars of the Georgian Muslim community. The analysis of the activities of parties involved in the base of information disseminated through mass media and fieldwork materials. Historical backgrounds. The formation of the first approaches of religion politics was to a great extent influenced by the Soviet period, which was distinguished by restricting of religion institutions, repressions, and the establishment of new Soviet rituals. Religious practice did not disappear, and religious rules of hidden circumcision, funeral, and religion marriage continued to be carried out. This kind of situation encouraged the transmission of religious tradition in Islam. Thus, religion revival that started in the end of 1980s was based on the religious rules and customs maintained in the Soviet period and those persons who inherited relevant knowledge. The changes in the religious structure in the Soviet period were followed by the reorganization of the Transcaucasian Muslim community and the transfer of its center from Tbilisi to Baku. The first period, in approximately 1985 and 89, believers addressed the social institution with the request on restoration of the constructions. This process took place side by side with the process of fighting for independence. During the restoration of independence, national ideals took particular importance, and orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy, played an increasing role. In the beginning of the 19th, before the local government strengthened its position and during popular demonstration against the political crisis in Georgia, Hasan Abashidze was supported by a number of important Muslim religion leaders. Hasan Abashidze was a leader of Adjara. It should be noted that after the government had strengthened in Adjara, the encouragement of creation of the local partially independent mufti was considered a first step. The authorities made use of opportunity to control leaders of the Muslim community during the election. Before 1993, when the political crisis was overcome, 68 different types of religious and educational facilities had been built or put into operation. Here we would like to focus on two moments. First, the number of those young people who leave for various countries to get religion education increased over time. In order to support this process, a special information database was created, which was disseminated at the first by several individuals and later by the Batumi Mosque. The database included a list of foreign institutions, most of them in Turkey, and their requirements for Georgian citizens to be able to get religious education, mostly free of charge. This turn led to an active community of young Muslims. The second period, it's from 1994 to 2000. The involvement of religious representatives in the social process and public activities was increasing over this period. Representatives of the Patriarchate, Christian Patriarchate, were increasingly becoming actively involved in state activities. Active discussion over the role of so-called tradition and the non-traditional religious branches in building up and develop of the civil societies as the Georgian nation and the state started. Relations with the followers of non-traditional religions become tense. In this period, a new tendency occurred. Educational institutions in Turkey demonstrate particular interest in selecting young people distinguished by their knowledge and skills who were able to obtain high-quality religious education and develop social skills and abilities, sending them to high-ranking educational institutions. The number of young religious people increased over time, creating the need for employment and self-realization. If we look through the statistic, 115 different types of Muslim facilities were put into function in Western Georgia in this period. Also, 25 seasonal houses of worship were opened. The third period. Conflict with so-called non-traditional religious branches become critical. This period from 2000 to 2004. The results of surveys revealed an increasing level of trust in the population towards the Christianity Patriarchate and the Patriarch, in part leading to a constitutional amendment. This period governance in Adjara was distinguished by increasing tensions with the central government. During these years, there were frequent talks about how the leader of Adjara supported Muslims, mosque restoration and building works, visited Muslim center and met parish. Although those meetings did not take traditional forms and were part of already existing policy. Some Muslims, particularly those young people who gained an education in Turkey, believed that Hasan Abashidze, leader of Adjara, during his governments, exercised particular restriction towards Muslims. Some of these young people gained the knowledge needed for the social activity together with religious education. Consequently, they used their skills to actively engage in social and political processes. In 2004, the demonstration taking place in Batumi was joined by some young religious people dressed up in religious clothing. Under these conditions, 29 different types of new buildings were set into operation. The fourth period, from 2004 to 2010. The Rose Revolution revealed a new set of tendencies in religious politics. The new Georgia declared by the authorities required the creation of new symbols, and amongst the symbols in the religious sphere. However, a clear policy towards Muslims had not been formed even during this period. Several groups tried to fight for the leadership of Georgian Muslims, resulting in the adjustment of the interest of this group and the state. However, it turned out to be complicated to arrange legal status without legislative changes. From the Rose Revolution onwards, central mosques have been visited by official and various religious holidays. In regard to education abroad, the number of people willing to gain religious education has not decreased. As a result of these processes, a large number of religious figures of youngsters working in the religious field were already present in Western Georgia. In fact, these people became actively involved in the ongoing processes, including the creation of NGOs, participation in social and political events, and engagement with various publication or internet publication like blogs, social networks, and others. 23 buildings had been constructed or rebuilt by this period. In 2010, the position of Mufti was taken by a new person. The process of registering the Muslim administration, Samukto, began. At the first stage, the Muslim administration of Ajara as a non-governmental organization has been established. However, the exciting form had a set of drawbacks in the legislative context, as well as the status did not appear to be acceptable for the believers. In order to mitigate legislative drawbacks and register other religious organizations, legislative amendments have been made to the civil code. In 2011, through merging the Shia organization functioning in the Tbilisi and the Sunni organization functioning in Batumi, the unified, independent and plenipotentiary Muslim unity, which functioned in the territory of Georgia, administration of Muslim of all Georgia, had been created. It was separated from the Caucasian administration existing in Baku. From 2011 onwards, the activity of the administration had been targeted at the registration of the exciting mosque and imams and the improvement of the management system. However, it is important to pay attention to processes which took place at the same time. First, Azizi and new reality. The processes interesting regarding the Muslims were developing in 2010 and 2012. We talk about the construction of the so-called Azizi mosque issued and the consequences. This issue had an influence on the consolidation of Muslims, their supporters, and their opponents. The content of argument, political processes, political activities, international relations. Finally, this issue resulted in the split of society. First of this is the Madli case. Now, was the first serious opposition between the state and Muslim community which followed the campaign against the Madli 2005, the religious educational institution network launched in 2010. For the state structures, this was just the next task. Madli 2005, the Muslim education network, based on the decision of court, had to pay fines for the tax evasion. The property should have been destroyed, confiscated, and the network leaders arrested. The state revealed a willingness to give the legislative shape to one of part of religious education institution. This action was considered to be unfair by some Muslims, especially young Muslims, and it was followed by the actions in protest of the decision. The wide-scale nature of the demonstration was conditioned by the tradition of the mutual support and collaboration exciting in the Zemwachar upper mountain part of the region. The regulation of the processes was encouraged by passing a new law and the registration of the Muslim administration, as problematic property was put under its control. Due to the disagreement with the process, the acting mufti resigned and the head of the municipality was dismissed. The above process resulted in legislative changes, the registration of the administration, changes of the Muslim leadership, and the creation of new form of relation. Moreover, during this period, a number of figures spoke to society, informing them of the position of interested groups. Law on religion. The amendment of the law on religion caused the establishment of the Muslim administration and formation of various groups within the Muslim community, supporters, opponents, independent groups, and others. Consequently, other organizations were formed. Discussion of the law resulted in a consolidation of the interested group. Thus, their terms, arguments, and symbols were established. Internet and social networking have become a means of protest and process management. The main watershed of the party still was the rights of the Orthodox Christians and the Church. Establishment of the administration. It was in the state interest to put the religious organization within the legislative framework and in compliance with the regulation. The religious persons and the state officials considered an increasing opportunity of Muslim integration, improvement of organization and financial activities, minimization of the Muslim-related problems, and finally elaborating of the new religious policy as an advantage of the administration establishment. However, according to Muslim religious leaders, the contradiction associated with the construction of a new mosque still existed. All was caused by the lack of appropriate regulation. Since registration, Muslim organizations have had formal relations with the government. There were two sides against the registration of the administration. One of them was the part of Azerbaijani Muslim community, nationalists, the supporters of Sheikh, Muslim leader, and the second one was the part of Georgian Muslim community, young clergymen. They negatively assessed the establishment of the administration for the variety of reasons. Azerbaijanians protested the establishment of the administration as its existence was considered an infringement of their interest. They considered it unacceptable to reduce the influence of Azerbaijanians and diminish the role and the importance of Caucasian Muslim in ruling the Muslim of Georgia. They launched an active protest campaign and established parallel independent organization in the framework of this campaign. Young Georgian Muslims protested because they had been ignored during the establishment of the administration, and away from its management caused their resentment. New mosque in Batumi. In parallel to Mavli-related activities, legislative changes in the administration registration process, the issue for construction of a new mosque for the Muslim community in Batumi was activated. There were various reasons to justify the need for a new mosque. Prior to this process, the government of Georgia and Turkey had started negotiations for restoration of Georgian and Turkish cultural heritage sites. The leaders of the Muslim community were interested in the idea of new mosque construction and positively evaluated the project. However, they were not involved in these processes. As started above, consolidation of the interested groups had begun before the process related to the Sultan Abdulaziz Mosque started. It continued during its first stage until it became a topic of public concern. Also, the arguments, symbolic, emotional, political, were combined that confirmed the legitimacy of each side's requirements. Later, during the election, the Sultan Abdulaziz Mosque became one of the components of the political struggle. What information were the process participants based on? It's important that despite the increasing interest towards the issue, the supporters, opponents, or experts shared their opinions in the absence of any official documents. The ruling party didn't want all parties to be involved in the negotiations as it didn't have the final version of the agreement or an engagement strategy. Thus, it was interested in social benefiting from the possible outcomes of the ongoing negotiations. State position. In their public speeches on the necessity of negotiations and project realizations, the state officials mainly paid attention to the way of declaration and emotional arguments. One of the major obstacles to realize the project was disagreement with the Patriarchate. In order to strengthen its position, the government actively tried to show the public the basic political, symbolic, and emotional consequences which could have been the outcomes of the successful negotiations. The opponents. The statement published in social network were a response to information spread through media. As the comments were made mainly for the election electorate, a populist language were applied. In the political box, politicians criticized the political situation in the country rather than discussing the arguments, discussed construction and the restoration issues. Since 2012, recognizability was become very important for the politicians. Thus, they paid more attention to pay the frequency and the content of their opinions in media. Each politician tended to announce that he represented the interest of various groups of citizens. Therefore, lack of information and position of the government in the pre-election time contributed to the activity of the opponents and spread of different versions. Construction of the Aziz Mosque became an issue of personal and party conflict at the background of weak awareness contributed to development of fears and threats. Such processes furthered popularity of a new politicians who managed to attract supporters through popular language and noticeable rhetoric. Thus, they became popular and finally changed political pictures completely. Demonstrations. The process against the Sultan Abdulaziz were expressed through protest and demonstrations. The initiators of the demonstration were the church and political and social union representatives. Information was disseminated through the internet. It should be noted that the group of Muslims involved in the demonstration manifested as a legitimate modeling of Georgian Muslims vis-à-vis the area of nationality, knows on history, realize on place of the national model of social relation, tries to be the better Georgians in Georgian community. Results. Starting again.
Yeah.
What were the consequences of Azizi Mosque issues? First, the political coalition, the composition of which was essentially influenced by the opposition parties of the process, won in election of 2012. Second, the gain of political power was not followed by any clear consequences, neither in terms of making negotiation public nor the transparency of the information regarding the Aziz Mosque issue. The issue of constructing a new mosque in Batumi has remained unchanged for the new state officials, former oppositions, former state officials, Muslims and opponents. So, third, the protest of the Azerbaijani side regarding the formation of Caucasian Muslim administration in particular was expressed the formation of the alternative organization. Since the reorganization of the administration in 2030, a leader of Shias, Sheikh, represents Azeri Muslims, while Georgian Muslims are represented by the Mufti of the West Georgia. From the end of 2012, there were several conflict situations related to Muslims in Georgia. Duty, innocent policies, harassment, and internal factors, tensions, and confrontation developed in Nixianits, in Tzkharo, Tsikhiziri, Samta Tzkharo, Chela, this is the villages of Georgia, among a number of other areas. In all cases, there had been previous incidents that resulted in the creation of at least two opposition groups of or various interested parties. The conflict itself gained peculiar features that reflected religious, political, cultural, and regional character. It should be highlighted that the problems were mainly resolved by the Muslim administration and the Patriarchate. It's noteworthy that everybody from Nixon to Chela applied the arguments that merged around the topic of Azizi Mask. And five, as related to the role of Turkey and its growing influence of the religious processes in Georgia, recently the Turkish side has selected smart and outstanding young people for high-class institution who have the opportunity to obtain qualified religious education and relevant experience for social activities. Thus, participation and the impact of Turkey on the Georgian Muslim community has gradually increased. The young people educated in Turkey formed and actively used public and NGOs. They considered it necessary to increase their political activity, including party establishment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll now move to the east to Xinjiang with Timothy Grose, who is an assistant professor of China Studies at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology in Depot in Indiana. Timothy completed his PhD in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington in 2014. His work on Uyghur ethno-national identity, the Xinjiang class boarding school, and everyday expressions of Islam in Xinjiang has appeared in the Journal of Contemporary China, Asian Studies Review, China Fine, the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs, and in James Labels and Chen Yangbing edited volume Minority Education in China, Balancing Unity and Diversity in an Era of Critical Pluralism. And Timothy will talk today about re-embracing Islam in Neidi, the Xinjiang class, and the dynamics of Uyghur ethno-national identity. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. First, I'd like to thank, of course, Sebastian for the generous invitation, an opportunity to speak at George Washington. I also want to extend a gratitude to Ashley. I don't know if she's in the room, but she made it possible for me to enter my room for the evening. So that was very good, so I could freshen up before the talk. I'd like to thank more generally the Central Asian Program for organizing these type of events for especially early career scholars like myself. These are the type of events that really recharge the batteries. Especially we're at a quarter system and I still have 6 weeks to go before the quarter ends. So this is going to be the last push for me to get through my first year in my new job. Today's talk draws on 30 months of field research conducted in Beijing and in several oases of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region between 2006 and 2014, a period in which I spoke with over 60 graduates of this Xinjiang class boarding school program, which is the general subject of my research. Being in DC, I thought it would be most appropriate to begin our talk with the debate. And again, to kind of situate us about my talk and some of the tensions that these graduates of the boarding school face, I think the debate between some of my friends really illustrates this point. In May 2011, I spent an afternoon with 4 graduates of the Xinjiang class, which in Chinese is the Neidi Xinjiang Gaodongban, in Uyghur the Iskili Ukulayuki Xinjiang Tulukutala Snipri, a national level boarding school program for mostly Uyghur students, which was established by the Chinese Communist Party in the year 2000. It was unseasonably hot for Beijing in May, so Murat, a native of Aksu in southern Xinjiang, suggested that we find a shady place to chat over tea and watermelon slices. Murat methodically sliced a watermelon into perfect wedges and displayed the pieces on the table. "See, it's as if we were in Xinjiang," he joked. After we finished our conversation, Murat cleared the watermelon rinds and the piles of seeds littering the table, and then he paused suddenly to ask his companions, "Do we need to perform a dua Kalisimus Kalakmu, referring to the prayer of supplication or invocation recited by some Muslims after a meal?" "I don't know. Ukhliman," the other shrugged. A short debate ensued on whether eating a watermelon is considered as a meal and would therefore require a dua. The 4 individuals finally agreed to err on the side of caution and offered a short prayer. Satisfied with their decision, my friends reseated themselves around the table, raised their open palms toward their faces, uttered "God is great, Allahu Akbar," and feigned wiping their faces, which signaled the completion of their invocation. This extended anecdote neatly encapsulates the tensions experienced by many graduates of the Xinjiang class. On the one hand, these young Uyghurs, educated in Chinese cities and divorced from their parents' influence, have not always learned with confidence some of the religious rituals and social customs common to Uyghur communities. This observation is reflected in my 4 friends' confusion surrounding the necessity to offer a dua after eating watermelon. These particular individuals performed dua after eating meals, but they hesitated over the religious obligations tied to eating a snack. On the other hand, the eventual decision to perform dua suggests or reflects the tendency for Xinjiang class graduates to express themselves as Muslim and, by extension, proper Uyghurs in ways forbidden in the boarding schools they attended. Since Xinjiang class students are strictly prohibited from engaging in religious practice, the four individuals' simple act of performing dua suggests resistance to the CCP's attempt to interpolate, and here I'm drawing on Louis Latusser's concept of interpolation, to interpolate these young Uyghurs as minority members of the Zhonghua Minzu, or the Chinese nation. These students have instead embraced countervailing non-state calls or interpolations on how to be Uyghur, a non-Chinese ethno-national identity that is bound by Uyghur language and Central Asian Islamic cultural norms. Arguably, the most dramatic reform to state schooling in Xinjiang is being implemented far beyond that of the autonomous region borders. In 1999, the General Office of the State Council formally established the Xinjiang class as part of its broader efforts to strengthen minority education, or 加强少数民族教育. The program, which officially began the following academic year, is designed to attract minority Minzu students from Xinjiang, primarily young Uyghurs, to complete their senior secondary schooling, or Gaozhong, in Neidi. From 2000 to 2014, yearly enrollment has increased steadily from 1,000 to 10,000 students. By 2014, over 35,000 individuals had graduated from the Xinjiang class, and another 35,000 students were actively enrolled in the program. Enrollment is shaped by a comprehensive quota system. A student's Minzu status, hometown, and financial background are considered in order to ensure that 80% of all incoming students are from southern Xinjiang's impoverished and rural nomadic areas, which also ensures that about 80% of the students are Uyghur. When you look at the actual classes scattered across China, usually enrollment is much higher. The percentage of Uyghurs is much higher, around 90, 95, even 98%. The number of schools hosting a Xinjiang class has correspondingly increased from 12 to 91, and these schools are spread across 45 cities. There are originally 12 cities represented in the red dots, and the 45 additional cities when the program, during its last expansion, which occurred in 2010. Academically, the boarding school program prepares students for China's National College Entrance Examination, or the Gaokao. During the 4-year course of study, which includes 1 year preparatory courses, or Yuke, students study China's national curriculum, while special emphasis is placed on mastering Chinese. To meet the latter goal, all courses are conducted in Putonghua, China's national language, and students are expected to continue speaking Putonghua outside the classroom. According to recent figures provided by Tianshannet, over 90% of all Xinjiang class graduates attend either a 4-year university or a technical school in Neidi, or in Inner China. While in the Xinjiang class, students maintain a tightly structured schedule of coursework conducted entirely in Chinese and monitored self-study. Students are expected to work up to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they study the same curriculum, including the textbooks, as local Han Chinese students. And here's a typical schedule that was recreated by some of my informants. So basically from 6:30 a.m. till 10 at night, when lights are shut off, they're engaged in some form of study. Politically, the Xinjiang class is intended to train a new generation of minority Minzu elite who are sympathetic to the party and who, in the wake of recent violence, can provide a stabilizing element to society in Xinjiang. To this end, Xinjiang class students, the vast majority again of whom are Muslim, are thrust into a Han cultural milieu where they adhere to a rigid set of school policies, many of which are aimed at curbing religious practice. With the exception of being provided halal or qingzhen meals, strict prohibitions have been placed on Islamic rituals as mundane as greeting each other with the expression Assalamu alaikum, or peace be upon you, to practices with more explicit religious overtones such as reciting post-meal supplications, or these dua, and performing Islam's obligatory 5 daily prayers, or the Bashfaq namaz. Meanwhile, students are expected to participate in festivals that are usually associated with Han culture, for example, Spring Festival, Mid-Autumn Festival, Qingming Festival. CCP officials and school administrators give primacy to political indoctrination before educational goals, which sets the Xinjiang class apart from otherwise similar regional boarding schools attended by Han students. The administrative procedure of the Xinjiang class, one of the program's governing documents, is explicit about the political importance of the boarding school program. Article 1 announces that in order to train qualified senior secondary school graduates in Xinjiang who support the Chinese Communist Party's leaders, love China, love socialism, defend the unity of China, and uphold the principle of Minzu unity or Minzu Chuanjie, and are determined to dedicate themselves to socialist modernly carry out the national education policy, Minzu policies, and quality education. Article 10 adds, and here I won't read everything, but I want to draw your attention to the passage highlighted in red. Special attention will be placed on strengthening support for the Chinese Communist Party, on loving the socialist motherland, on upholding the unity of Chinese patriotic education, and on strengthening education on Minzu unity. With its schools scattered in eastern China, the Xinjiang class program effectively limits the time Xinjiang class students spend with their families. The sheer distance between Xinjiang and most major Neidi cities make visitations extremely difficult. Take, for example, Uyghur students from Khotan, who are schooled in Guangzhou. The distance between the two cities is approximately 3,600 miles. In order for these students to arrive in Guangzhou, they must first travel by train to Urumqi, the regional capital. This trip alone takes nearly 36 hours. Once in Urumqi, students need to wait at least an additional day before another train departs for Guangzhou. When students finally board the train in Urumqi, they must endure a 52-hour trip to Guangzhou. That is, if the train arrives on schedule. The entire trip then can extend to the better part of 1 week. Considering the fact that Xinjiang class students must make this trip twice each summer, once to visit home and then once to return to the boarding school, students can spend 2 weeks out of the 6 to 8 week summer recess traveling. Invariably, the Xinjiang class program uses every available resource to promote the Chinese language. Consistent with the year of preparatory studies, coursework during the remaining 3 years of the Xinjiang class is conducted entirely in Putonghua, and students are required to speak Putonghua in most social situations. According to a set of regulations representative of most Xinjiang class schools, students must, 1, speak only Putonghua during class and their daily activities, 2, students must communicate only in Putonghua during organized outings, and finally, students are encouraged to use Putonghua for all communication regardless of location. The implication here being that when they're at home during summer, they're also encouraged to speak Putonghua. Students are required to abide by strict rules. The most serious punishments are reserved for those students who engage in religious practice. Actions resulting in a student's immediate expulsion in the order that are listed in the school's, the Xinjiang class student regulations book are 1, participating in any form of ethnic separatist activity or illegal religious activity, and 2, engaging in feudalistic superstitious activities. Religious activities including prayer, and here they just use the generic libai, and they don't differentiate between the obligatory prayers and dua, especially if the student has been reprimanded several times and has not changed the behavior. One exception to the ban on religious practice is halal meals, and actually each school that hosts a Xinjiang class is required, if they already have a halal cafeteria, to build one, and meals are prepared by either a Hui or Uyghur chef. The harsh punishments for openly practicing Islam compelled my informants to obey the Xinjiang class's policy on religion. However, once these students graduated from the boarding school, many began to cultivate personal piety. As university students in Neidi, young Uyghurs enjoy a relatively relaxed political climate. They do not risk serious repercussions for attending prayers at mosque. They serve a less regulated internet than that in Xinjiang. They have opportunities to meet foreign Muslim students, and they can return to Xinjiang during both winter and summer recess. Graduates of the Xinjiang class are therefore exposed to several non-state ideologies, which also shape these individuals' ethno-religious identities. And it was hard to kind of capture what I was trying to get at here, but thinking of how these Uyghurs construct their ethno-national identities and religious practice, thinking of it in terms of spheres of influence. Once they're outside of the boarding school, the sphere of influence that is the state becomes smaller. And they have other avenues to get Islamic knowledge, whether that's the internet, their family members, foreign Muslims in cosmopolitan cities. So hopefully I've captured that well enough. In ways similar to Uyghur youth in Xinjiang, Xinjiang class graduates generally express their ethno-national identity through Islamic practice. Many young women began reading the Quran as university students. During the 2010 fall semester, word had spread among Beijing Normal University's Uyghur students that a nearby university was offering free public Arabic classes. A group of 5 female Xinjiang class graduates from Beijing Normal, all of whom spent their early childhoods in either Kashgar or Khotan, regularly participated in the program. Unlike many university students in Beijing who use their weekends to escape heavy workloads, these young women elected to study another foreign language in their leisure time. Over lunch with this group of young women, I asked about their motivations for studying Arabic. They hoped the weekend classes would provide the necessary foundations required for pronouncing Quranic verses correctly. Rana, a 2010 Beijing Xinjiang class graduate, originally from Khotan, simply took advantage of Beijing's cosmopolitan population to learn about Islam. Rana's interest in Islam began during her childhood after her grandparents returned to Khotan from a pilgrimage to Mecca. While in Beijing, Rana desired to form more meaningful relationships with Muslims living in China's capital, so she began to attend Friday prayers, or the Jummah, at the mosque maintained by the Sudanese embassy, a mosque where Muslims from around the world congregate each Friday. After Rana performed namaz each Friday, she would meet with several other young women to learn how to recite the Quran in Arabic. One second. Several women also began to veil. Although a few of these young women veiled to appease their husbands' or in-laws' demands, some young women voluntarily chose to cover their heads. While some saw veiling as a fashion statement, others veiled to express their commitment to Islam. One of my informants expressed that I put on my veil, and when I wear it, it reminded me of my religion, my faith, and my God. These are the most important reasons for me veiling. So again, it's not because her husbands or her in-laws are telling her, and it's not to make some kind of fashion trend, which some of my informants did, but there was actually, this to her symbolized and represented her membership in a kind of a trans-national Islamic identity. A significant number of my male informants also embraced some tenets of Islam. These young men put forth a concerted effort to perform Islam's obligatory 5 daily prayers, despite hectic class schedules. Adil, a native of Kashgar and a graduate of the Guangzhou Xinjiang class, stood out as one of my most devout informants. Although Adil's father worked as a police officer in Xinjiang and thus was forbidden from openly practicing Islam, Adil learned at a young age how to perform namaz from his grandfather. After he graduated from the Xinjiang class, Adil recommitted himself to the 5 daily prayers. If his class schedule conflicted with a prayer time, Adil simply prayed immediately after his class. In another example of Adil's commitment to prayer, Adil attended the weekly Jummah at the mosque 40 minutes away by public bus. Murat, the individual from Aksu, whom I introduced at the beginning of this talk, followed the same Islamic prayer schedule. Murat prayed 5 times daily in a space he set aside in his dormitory room. The space, which was large enough to allow several individuals to simultaneously perform the ritual prostrations required for namaz, was set apart from the otherwise drab concrete room by several vibrantly colored prayer mats, or jai namaz. Murat had hung a large poster depicting Hajj pilgrims circumambulating the Kaaba on the west-facing wall of his room, which indicates the direction of Mecca. Several dopa, or embroidered hats, which Murat wore while praying, and a set of prayer beads draped from several hooks which had been fastened just below the poster of Mecca. Although he appeared to execute the prayers without flaw, Murat often doubted his ability to correctly perform namaz. In an attempt to refine his prostration, Murat routinely consulted websites that offered step-by-step instructions on performing the prayers, and he emulated the photos and videos they provided. To a certain extent, my informants expressed themselves as Muslims through diverse Islamic practices that appear to be determined by gender. Other forms of devotion, however, blur gender divisions in religious practice. The recitation of post-meal prayer, or the dua, described at the beginning of the talk, provides one such example. In the company of other Uyghurs, my informants recited these quick prayers of supplication after every meal, and as the introduction to this talk has shown, sometimes even after eating snacks. On a strictly practical level, performing dua requires little commitment or formal instruction. Although the majority of my informants did not attend religious schools as children in Xinjiang, they had likely learned how to perform dua from their parents or grandparents. If an individual did not know how to perform dua, he or she could easily mimic his or her peers. Even I quickly learned the required hand movements and proper utterances. Due to this simplicity, then, performing dua provides an opportunity for otherwise non-practicing Uyghurs to publicly reaffirm their commitments to Islam. On another level, dua appeared to be performed by my informants in Beijing as another form of symbolic boundary maintenance, and here I'm drawing upon the work of Joanne Smith-Finley. In Beijing, Uyghur-owned Xinjiang-style restaurants attracted a mostly Han clientele, especially those upscale restaurants offering song and dance performances. Han students also frequent university halal or Xinjiang cafeterias. Having in a sense then become a minority of their own food culture in Beijing, Xinjiang class graduates seek ways to reclaim, quote-unquote, their culture. Uyghur graduates of the Xinjiang class can visibly reinforce ethnic boundaries vis-a-vis Han patrons through the performance of dua. I have argued that the renewed interest in and reinterpretations of Islam among my informants evidence a strengthening of a Uyghur ethno-national identity. Significantly, the religious practices being preserved by Xinjiang class graduates are the very deep-rooted cultural norms the CCP, through the Xinjiang class, attempts to undermine and replace with elements common to mainstream Han culture. Therefore, by embracing Islam, these young individuals are simultaneously rejecting Chinese state interpolations and embracing a non-Chinese ethno-national identity. This is not to say that Uyghur graduates of the Xinjiang class are more nationalistic, or even more religious than their non-Xinjiang class Uyghur peers. However, this study has shown that despite being immersed in Han Chinese culture and force-fed a curriculum that valorizes loyalty to the Chinese party state and the Zhonghua Minzu, Uyghur graduates of the Xinjiang class are no more likely to express feelings of Chinese patriotism or means unity than their non-Xinjiang class Uyghur peers. Instead of training a patriotic generation of Uyghurs, the Xinjiang class has led, or at least allowed, a group of highly educated, socially conscious individuals develop religious sensibility.